view. And so if you wanted to be able to run descriptive statistics and you wanted to run them another way, so previously we used frequencies, you could also use descriptives. And once again, you have to say what do you want to run that on. So let's say that we're going to say public versus private again. And let's do instructional expenditures again, just so we're working with the same variables. And once again, you're going to go into options. And you have the same sort of options here. So we can say we want the range, we want the mean, we want the minimum and the maximum, we want the standard deviation. And once again, you're going to click paste. And it should open your syntax window, but if it doesn't, that's fine. You can go to Window, click Syntax, and there it is. And whatever you do, whatever the last operation is that you selected, that you said paste, will be the last operation shown in your syntax window with a space. So I'm going to highlight the operation I want to run. I'm going to click the play arrow. And that's then going to perform the operation. So here is our output table. So it gives you a much more concise table here. And once again, you can see how everything shook out as far as the range, the mean, the maximum, the minimum. It gives you a little less nuanced data. And it didn't give you the option to show percentages because it didn't give you the frequencies. This is what this is showing, is frequencies, so how often a count occurs. But if you wanted to, and you just wanted to quickly find the range, the maximum, the minimum, and the mean, you could find that here. This information will correspond exactly to the information that we found earlier. So that is how you find your basic descriptive statistics. So let's go back to our data set. And once again, all of those are under Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and either frequencies or descriptives. So you also might want to produce graphical outputs because they can be even more easily digestible and provide a quicker snapshot of what's going on in your data. So we don't really have a perfect variable, though, to provide a basic bar graph within this data. So I'm also going to show you how to transform a variable to be able to do that if you choose to do so. So let's say we wanted to transform a variable. We would go to transform, and you have two options. You could recode into the same variables. Generally speaking, you would never want to do that because once you recode into the same variable, you can't ever go back to that original variable that was in your data set before. You've essentially lost the nuance of that data, especially for what we're going to do now, because we might want those original values. So generally speaking, you almost always recode into different variables. And so let's work with that instructional expenditures variable again. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to click my arrow to say that's the variable I want to work with. And now I have to provide a new name because I'm creating a new variable. So what do I want to name it? So the name can't contain any spaces. So for this, I'm going to say expenditure underscore, and we're going to say it's called recoding because I'm actually recoding the variable. And for the label, I'm going to say this is instructional expenditures recode it. And I don't want to click change yet because change will finalize it. First, I want to work with the values, so old and new values. So first, how was the data previously represented? That's what we're going to say with the old values. And that can go a couple of different ways. For this, we want to work with ranges of the data. So basically, instead of having each individual school be listed from any amount, 18,000 to 1,800 to 63,000, I want to be able to chunk that data out. So I'm going to take it from being continuous data where it could have been anything, and I'm going to convert it into discrete data. So there's going to be sort of chunked, gapped data. So I'm going to work with ranges. And the first thing I'm going to do is the very lowest value through, we're going to say $5,000. So lowest to $5,000. And for the new value for that, we're going to say 1. And so this is similar to what we did with the private versus public. If you think about that, all public schools were coded with a 2, and all private schools were coded with the 1. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that for all sets of the data. So The next range that I want to work with are 5,000 and a penny to 10,000. And I'm going to say that's 2. And I'm going to work through 10,000 and a penny through 15. And we're going to call that 3. And let's chunk this out a little bit more. So we're going to say this one's going to be 15,000 through 20. And that's going to be, and once again, I need to make it a penny because they can't overlap. And then we're going to do 20,000 and a penny through the highest. And we're going to code that one with a 5. So add, and then once again I click continue. And now I can say change. And when I say change, it's going to allow me to then create this new variable here. And so if I wanted to save that syntax again, I could click paste. I can then open up my syntax window. And so if I highlight and click this, it's going to create that new variable for me. So here's my output window saying that I've created this variable. And then I can go back to the data set. I can also open the windows down here too. So if I go into variable view and I scroll to the bottom, here's my new variable that we just created. So we need to do one more thing here because this isn't going to be very meaningful for us right now. If we were to make a graph of this, all that's going to show up is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's not going to be very helpful for the end user. We want them to know what 1 means, what 2 means, what 3 means, what 4 means. And so to be able to change that, we have to go in here to values. And so you just click on the values box, and you'll see this little ellipses box next to it that you click on it. And it'll open up the values labels dialog box. And so I have to remember what I coded before. So 1 is actually less than $5,000. So I'm going to add that. 2 is 5,001 to 10,000. 3 is 10,001 to 15,000. 4 is 15,001 to 20,000. And 5 is more than 20,000. Add. Okay, so all of my labels are now in there, so I can say OK. And so now whenever I perform that operation, it's going to actually pull up and say what's in there. And so my measure, I want to be clear with that. It's not scaled anymore because obviously the chunk of data that's in more than 20,000 is going to be a wide berth of data. So it's not an accurate scale anymore. That movement between each one of those individual discrete blocks is that descriptive. But what it is it's ordinal. It'll let us know relative chunks about how much people are spending in each category. And so we're going to label that ordinal variable there. And so now that we have all that set, let's click Save. And probably what you'd really want to do in this scenario is you'd want to go to Save As, and you'd want to rename it. So you'd want to rename it with some new variable so that you have this data set is separated from your previous data set that's unaltered. So let's make a graph. So we go to Graphs here at the top of our toolbar in our data editor window, and we're going to go to Legacy Dialogues. So in this legacy dialogues are all the different types of graphs that are normally performed. And so we'll review all these in time, but for today we're just going to work with bar graphs. So there's two different types of bar graphs that you can run. Simple bar graphs are what they look like. They're just simple bar graphs. They're not clustered with the data. So we have different options here. We can show number of cases. Normally you're going to want to show percentage of cases. And so let's just work with something simple like public versus private. That's going to be our category access. And so that's what's going to be a longer bottom line. Titles, you always want to name your graph so people know what they're looking at. So we're going to say percentage of private and public colleges. Continue. And then we're going to click paste. So to put that in our syntax window, we open our syntax window, and then we're going to run that operation. And here's a simple graph that it'll produce for us. So you can see here's percentage of private and public colleges. Here's the percentage. So public colleges looks like it's a little less than 40. Private's a little bit more than 60. So let's say that we didn't like the way this looked. The simplest way is you can double click to activate it just like it says. And then it'll bring up our chart editor. And once we bring up our chart editor, we have some options here. And so we can relabel things if we wanted variable views. We can change the size. But let's say we don't want to work with any of that, because a more common thing that we might want to do is we might want to work with how nuanced these data points actually are in and of themselves, or we might want to rename them. And so we can go to options, and we can have different options within there. So we can change, and we can add an x-axis reference line, we can add a y-axis reference line. Those aren't really things that you would want to do with a bar graph, but you might want to do those if you had a scatter plot. So what we can do though, and what's more likely that you'd want to do, is you might want to edit how these are shown. So let's say you want to provide a little bit more nuance in the data there. Let's say we don't want our major increments to be in 20. We might want them to be in tens. So apply. And then you can see how that changes the data there. Now it's not great because now you can barely see public, but you can make it clear that, well, this is more like 35% and that's more like 65%. So let's put that back, and I'll show you how I did that again. So that's under Edit, Select, and you select whichever axis you want to work with. But for this purpose, it would be select the y-axis. And then you have labels and ticks, scales, number format, lines, variables. But we're working with scales. So we want the minimum to be 35. We want the max to be 65 because here's where our data lies. And let's say that we want this to be 5. And it'll change it accordingly. So now it's in 5% increments over here. And if we were to close this, it'll then update our chart or our graph so it now looks like this. Okay, so now let's go back to our data window. And let's make another graph. So legacy dialogues, bar graph, and let's make a clustered graph, a clustered bar chart. So summaries of groups or cases, what we're going to work with. We're going to define it, and this time let's work with our new variable we just created. So instructional expenditures that we've recoded to be in those 5 groupings. And let's define our clusters by public versus private schools. So we want to see how many schools are in each one of those chunks based upon public versus private status. And once again, in the bars represent percent of cases is what we want instead of numbers. And we need to put in title. So this is going to be educational expenditures by institutional type. Continue. And then once again, we're going to click paste so that it goes to our syntax window. We'll open our syntax window, and we'll then run that operation to generate our bar graph. So here we have a bar graph. You can now see the labels at the bottom. If we hadn't made these labels, it would have just said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which wouldn't have been very meaningful to anyone who is trying to understand what this means. But this gives you a really quick snapshot of how many schools by institutional type spend less than $5,000. And you can really see some patterns in the data is that public schools generally are going to be clumped more in the lower regions. They're spending less than 5,000, and they're definitely spending less than 10,000 on a whole. And once you get to private schools, you see that flip. You see very few public schools that are spending more than 20, and you see quite a few private schools that are spending more than 20 on educational expenditures. So that's a quick basic overview of SPSS. The last thing you'll want to make a note of, once again, is before you close, you'd want to save whatever you want to keep, because each individual window has to be saved because they save at different formats. So if you want to save the output window, go to File, go to Save As, and then you'll save the output and save that in whatever folder you'd like to keep it. Okay, I'm not going to save it today. So when you go to close it, if you haven't saved it, it's going to save contents of output viewer window. If you haven't already saved it, you'd want to say yes so that you can then save it in some place, but I don't want to save it. So the same with the syntax. You would want to save your syntax if you want to keep it. But once again, I don't need to do that today. And it's going to ask you the same question. I don't want to save it, so I'm going to say no. And then the same thing is going to happen with your data. So it's going to ask me, do I want to save it? And once again, I don't want to, so I'm going to say no. I'm sorry, I'm going to say yes, I want to proceed. So do you want to proceed? Yes. So that is just some basic tools in SPSS. We will review and let you all work with that more in class. And if you have any questions, you should please feel free to post those in discussion board. And we will try to answer those as well as your classmates. All right, thank you.